All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We are recording. One of the things I want to remind everyone is that if you are if you miss a class, course recordings have been posted onto Canvas. So what I do is I try to get all the recordings downloaded and then uploaded to YouTube, and then they're embedded into the Canvas course. And so just so you know, if you miss a class, just follow up and check out the class from the class you missed. I've had several folks ask about attendance and whatnot, and I'm willing to be flexible if you are. And so if you give me as a reminder, if you think that you're going to be missing class, just send me an email ahead of time, let me know, and then check out the recorded class when you at your earliest convenience. Okay. At the same time, also, you do know when your assignments are due, and so just as a reminder, pay attention to the syllabus, and when those due dates pop up, make sure that you're submitting accordingly. Okay. So today we're going to talk about ethics, and if we think about the lecture a few weeks ago, as it relates to the idea of values. If you've heard me in talk about the idea of professional ethics, we've always talked about it in the idea of it's the lens in which you make your decisions. Okay, and those ethics really is a personification or enactment of your values, right? In my previous role at the university, I've always played this role as an advisor to students, and it's so far as that, are they living to their values, being a fraternity advisor. And so when we think about the idea of values, big picture, right? What are your values? How are you living out those values? How are you making effective decisions within those values? Okay. When we think about ethics and the idea of the context of our professionalism, what it means to be an engineer, that's another thought altogether, right? And when we think about how we make decisions as engineers, right, there's many different frameworks for us to consider. And so today we're going to cover those, those various frameworks, and then apply it to a real situation, one that honestly, while it was introduced a few years ago, it's still relevant today because it's a form of technology that's not widely used, right? And so to kick us off, again, I want for us to consider this idea of the framework of our thinking, the framework of our values, right? And so when we think about that in particular, I draw your attention to the screen and what I'm about to show you. And more importantly, what I want for you to consider is, the method and the framework in which we use this. Okay, and so let's see here. Screen am I sharing? Here we go. When we think about our different frameworks, it's that of our moral frameworks, okay? And so there are three general moral frameworks for us to consider. And the first one is that of a consequentialist framework, right? When we think about the idea of a consequentialist framework, we think sometimes of several different approaches, and the idea of the utilitarian approach, right? Where it's one of the most common approaches to ethical decision making, and it applies to large groups, right? It instructs us to weigh the different amounts of good and bad that will be produced as a result of our action. Thinking about it in another sense, we also think about how a utilitarian action produces the greatest amount of good for an individual, which is an egoistic approach, right? And so when we think about these, the consequentialist approach, in a broader sense, as it relates to a society, we're talking about the general will, the general good of society and what it brings to us, right? So that's the first one. The second approach is that of duty, right? And it's a non-consequentialist approach where we follow the ethical decision based on obligation to our job, to our role, to our affiliation, right? And this is, when we think about this sense of duty, Immanuel Kant comes to mind, and his idea of the categorical imperative, right? There's also another sense of acting as in a way that you would treat humanity, right? Whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means to an end. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind as when we think about the idea of the sense of duty. The next area is that of virtue, right? When we think about virtuous decision making and frameworks of moral reasoning, it's this higher sense of virtue and the idea of being consistent with our values, right? In a sense, it takes along this idea of, what do we want to do? What do we want to be? So we focus on the character of an individual or the character of ourselves that might motivate us in a specific situation, right? When we think about the pros and cons of these three frameworks, I'm going back to the idea of the consequentialist framework here. Again, maximize pleasure, minimize the pain. It focuses on it's a more pragmatic approach, right? And the other part is that sometimes, and the thing that we need to be aware of when it comes to this consequentialist approach is that sometimes some of the actions that are expected to produce good consequences may end up harming people or harming a group, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind when it comes to being a consequentialist. When we think about our duty and the sense of and the pros and cons of our sense of duty and that framework, the advantage is that we are creating a system, right? That is consistent and a system of expectations for everyone, right? But the flip side to that is sometimes, what we best intend sometimes doesn't allow for flexibility, right? And we consider our duty and obligation as being for prohibiting something else from occurring. Okay, so when we think about that sense of duty and the rules that's associated with that, it's very rigid, and so we can't think beyond that sense of duty. Right? Finally, when we think about the idea of the pros and cons of a virtuous framework here, again, we're talking about the characteristics, both positive and negative, that might impact and motivate a situation, right? Sometimes these wide-ranging behaviors may be called or termed ethical. There might be different ways in which we approach this, or there's a misinterpretation of the definition of that specific characteristic. And so as a result, there are disputes and disagreements of what it means to be ethical or virtuous in that respect, right? When we put all three frameworks together, there are really 4 different things to keep in mind, okay? Going back to the consequentialist approach, when we think about an idea of being a deliberate consequentialist and the process someone conducts their thinking in this way, the question to ask is, what kinds of outcomes should I produce or try to produce? The focus of your reasoning is directing attention to future effects of an action for all people who will be directly and indirectly affected, right? The definition, and here's the key thing that separates this from the other two, the key definition of ethical conduct is the action that will achieve the best consequences, okay? And then the motivation is to produce the most good. When we think about our sense of duty and using that framework, the deliberative process and the question we ask ourselves is, what are my obligations in this situation? And what are the things I should never do? Okay, when we think about those two things, what are our boundaries, right? And what are, very different from the outcome. It's more of, the outcome is more of what do we need to produce, but in the idea of sense of duty is what are the limits of how I operate, right? So that's the thing to keep in mind. We focus the attention on the duties that exist prior to the situation, and from there we then determine the course of our obligations. The definition of ethical conduct in this respect then involves always doing the right thing and never failing to do one's duty, right? And then the motivation here is performing that right action. Finally, when we think about the deliberative process of being virtuous, the idea of our deliberative process and the question we ask ourselves, on top of the idea of what you see on the screen, who do we want to be? The other question is, what kind of person should I be that will show my actions and show my character, okay? So that's a little more specific. We focus direction and attention to discern those actual characteristics, right? And so what we're thinking about here are the properties of a good situation. In a sense, we're transferring our values, we're transferring the characteristics and definition of those values to the situation, okay? Ethical conduct here is whatever a virtuous person would do in the circumstances. To throw a South Park term here, what would Jesus do? It sounds I don't want to be lighthearted about it, but what you're constantly asking yourself is, what would someone do in this situation, right? Or what would your supervisor do? What would your mentor do? What would your higher being or higher person, the person that you look up to, what would they do, right? The aim is to develop one's character. So when we think about these three frameworks of reasoning and decision making, there are others, okay? But these are the three common ones. These are the three broad ones. And for what we are planning on doing with this, think about the questions. Think about, what the approach, the focus, the sense of ethical conduct, and more importantly, the motivation in the end, okay? Now, again, there are others, but for now, let's take a look at these three frameworks. And again, they are the consequentialist, right? The sense of duty, and virtue. Okay. What we're going to do now is really think about these processes and apply it to a scenario, okay? I draw your attention to this idea of ethics and code of ethics specific to how we conduct ourselves as engineers, right? And so as a reminder, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers introduced its code of ethics, and generally we'll review it from time to time. This is the most recent article on the association's code of ethics, passed in 2012, right? So when we think about the codes of ethics here, and this in particular, this one, there are three main values, if you will, okay? And that is to uphold and advance the integrity, honor, and dignity of the engineering profession by using their knowledge and skill for the enhancement of human welfare, okay? So it's really that, you have to be knowledgeable in the discipline, right? And apply it towards human welfare, right? Being honest and impartial and serving with fidelity their clients, and the public. So there's a sense of honesty, the sense of integrity, the sense of truthfulness. Okay. Well, however you define it, it's really presenting honest and impartial information. Okay. And also representing yourself in an honest and impartial way. And then finally, striving to increase the competence and prestige of the engineering profession. So when we think about all three of these principles, it's really about showing that you're competent, being honest and showing integrity, and increasing and enhancing the competence of the profession. And it's really building on the profession, promoting the profession, that of mechanical engineering. Okay. It's also then broken down into, I want to say 10 different statements here, and then I will post this in Canvas and let you read through this. But from these fundamental canons and these value statements, you get to this idea of sense of safety, sense of security, which is something that a lot of people tend to promote as a value within mechanical engineering, right? But as you can see here, it is a value statement, and it's actually number 1, right? Engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public in the performance of their professional duties, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. When we think about the idea of your reputation, your integrity, that's further stated here in other contexts and also other detail, right? In terms of how you conduct yourself, being trained and knowledgeable, potentially getting that certification if needed within a project or job, something to that effect. Again, it's this idea of showing competency and professionalism. Okay. So again, I will post that, but keep in mind these 3 values as we go into the application of this and this case study here. Again, it's the 3 values or fundamental principles of a mechanical engineer are using their knowledge and skill for the enhancement of human welfare. Second, being honest and impartial and serving with fidelity their clients and the public. Okay. And 3, striving to increase the competence and prestige of the engineering profession. Okay. Keep those 3 things in mind as we go into the scenario. And so the scenario that I want to pose to you is that of really autonomous vehicles, right? In recent years, we've heard stories of companies like Uber, Tesla testing out these vehicles, right? And so one of the things I want to share with you to add context to the scenario is a CBS This Morning piece on the ethics of driverless vehicles. Take a watch and listen.
Should self-driving cars make ethical decisions? That is the growing debate as the technology moves closer towards mainstream reality. A new study published in Science magazine asks how self-driving cars should act. More than 75% of participants in one survey favored cars that would sacrifice 1 passenger rather than kill 10 pedestrians. But overall, the study found people prefer to ride in a driverless car that protects passengers at all costs. CBS News contributor Nicholas Thompson is editor of the New Yorker magazine's website, newyorker.com. Nick, good morning.
Good morning, Charlie.
So what are we learning here?
Well, we're learning that this is a very interesting frontier that we're about to cross. When you make a driverless car, you have to put in all kinds of decisions about how you're driving the road, but you're also going to have to program ethics in a way that society hasn't really dealt with. How do you deal with a situation where somebody is crossing the road in front of you, and to avoid it, you would have to swerve off a bridge? That is something you'll have to write into the software. How we make those decisions is very complicated. What we've learned in the study is, as you say, people, when they look and they think, well, you know what? The best way to make these decisions, totally utilitarian. If you can save 2 people, if you kill 1 to save 2, you should do that.
Am I one of the ones that's dying?
Are you? Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
depends if you're a pedestrian or if you're in the car as a passenger, right?
Yeah.
You know, people, when they think about how they want the system to be designed, want sort of the most good for the most number, classic utilitarianism. When they think about their own vehicles, they want the most good maybe for me.
them.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
reminds me of my ethics 101 class in college at Georgetown University. But these are not just philosophical issues, they're going to involve legal issues too, right?
Right, they're gonna, because as the car software is set, those are decisions that the company can be made. So you can imagine a scenario where a car does something and then a lawyer says, well, you know what? The manufacturer's at fault because of the way they programmed in the morality into the software.
Even if it's a moral dilemma, you argue that this is more important to have driverless cars than not.
Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, the number of accidents I think will be dramatically reduced by driverless cars, right? Remember, driverless cars don't drink, they don't text, right? So you're going to have, and they have a lot more information. When they're on that bridge, they're going to know exactly where the
They don't
wall
fall
is.
asleep either.
They don't fall asleep, right? So driverless cars will massively improve safety, right? But they just open this whole new frontier of decisions that we are usually making instinctively. So they'll be making the same decisions with a lot more information. They'll probably make better decisions, but they're still complex decisions.
And who decides what is programmed into the decision-making process?
Well, you can imagine that it could be the government. The government could say, you know what? We have to do X, Y, and Z. Here are some standards. Here are some rules. Here are some principles. You can imagine that it's sort of left up to the manufacturer. You can imagine that there are kind of gradations on the cars that are sold. All these things are possible. We haven't really thought through these things as a society, but they're quite important.
But then when you lay out the questions, you sound like a bit of a heel because you want to save yourself as opposed to the pedestrians.
Right. So you can imagine, so perhaps the best solution.
I'm going to vote for me. I'm not kidding. I'm going to vote for me. I don't want to hit a child. But if it comes to, you know, my life or somebody else's, why wouldn't you want to save your own life?
Okay, well, what if it's 2? What if it's 3? What if
See,
it's
that's what I'm
1,000,
saying.
right? So where do you put the gradation? For
What about
everybody, it's
children who
different.
are
What if
the
it's
pedestrians?
somebody that
Well, my
What about
children
your
is
two
different.
children?
My children is different.
Suppose
My
you're going to
children
kill
is
the person that's going to discover a cure to cancer.
Right, or
different. I know, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
so what you have to have is you have to have a set of principles.
Wait, Charlie, wait a second. What would you do? It's you or a pedestrian? And it's just, you know, I don't know anything about this pedestrian. It's just you or a pedestrian, just a regular guy walking down the street.
And in
What I do,
Yeah.
I would
if
brake.
I was driving,
I would just brake.
No, you have to
To
make a
save both of
decision.
us.
Yeah, that would be the ideal
you're saying
thing.
you have to make a decision. You
You have
don't
to
have a
make a
choice to
decision.
avoid the choice. You don't
Yes.
have the choice to avoid the
Yes,
choice.
yes. What would you do?
I would probably save myself,
Okay.
probably. But if I knew that person, more about that person, which you don't know, you know, it make a different decision.
Okay.
Nick,
All right. Thank you, Nick. Thank
you
you
don't
very
think
much.
we're crazy, do you?
No.
I actually think, you know what I like about this conversation? It's a chance for society to like set up morals again, right? This is a
Right.
great opportunity.
Right.
Thank
Do
you,
we
Nick.
really want to abandon those moral decisions to technology?
No.
Right. Thanks, Nick.
We don't.
All right. And so when we think about these ideas and these values and this context, right? What I want for you to think about, and I'm about to assign you into breakout rooms in a moment. I want for you to think about, the different frameworks. Again, there's the consequentialist framework, the duty framework, and then the virtuous framework, right? And so I'm gonna send you into breakout rooms. There's going to be 9 breakout rooms, okay? And when we think about those breakout rooms, I'm going to divide you based on the framework. And so when we look at, if you can see this, breakout rooms 1, 2, and 3. When you go into the breakout room, you'll see what you'll be told what room you're going into. So breakout rooms 1, 2, and 3 will view the situation from a consequentialist framework, 4, 5, and 6 from a duty-based framework, and then 7, 8, and 9 a virtuous framework. 2 questions asked or to consider. 1, how would you apply the framework to this idea, this scenario of driverless cars, right? And then secondly, what is the ethical question we need to answer, right? Everyone understand what we're doing? All right, I'm going to send you into breakout rooms. Now, you got 5 minutes. Okay, we're about to have everyone join us soon here. Okay, it seems like we have everyone back. So when we think about the different frameworks, if anyone from either group 1, 2, or 3, again, if you think about this from the idea of the scenario from a consequentialist framework, right? You know, the two questions were, how would you apply the framework to the scenario? And then what would be the ethical question we would need to answer? Would someone from either groups 1, 2, or 3 care to unmute and discuss and present what you discussed? Do I need to pick on somebody? Anyone in groups 1, 2, or 3 care to answer or put in the chat?
Some of the things that we discussed were maximizing pleasure, I think, would be living, obviously, and minimizing pain would be not dying. So if you're trying to do both of those, then I think the answer is injure / kill the least amount of people, whether that be in the car or individuals that are crossing the street. And a different way of looking at it, I thought maybe would be the car might need to sacrifice itself rather than like the individuals in it. So rather than just like driving off a bridge, slam the car into the wall. Well, the car might be totaled, but if you got the physics right, then you might be able to save the passengers and the people. Or I think it's never just black and white, die or don't die. So I think that as the engineers and scientists are trying to maximize and minimize, that they'll determine ways to do that aren't absolute at either end.
Great, thank you, John. And actually, we're going to go into that activity next, right? And so, really, from a consequentialist standpoint, don't kill people, right? But then the question I pose to you then would be, is it protect the passenger or protect those around you, right? And so hang on to that thought. For anyone in group 4, 5, and 6, this idea sense of duty, would anyone care to mention from or talk from either group 4, 5, or 6? Talk about how you apply the framework, and also what would be the ethical question we would need to answer. Anybody? Okay, I'm going to pick on Arthur.
So from a duty perspective, you have to look at what is a vehicle's primary purpose, which historically, in the way we design cars now, is to protect the passenger with airbags and whatnot. I mean, there aren't people catchers on the front of cars. Cars right now are designed, if you hit something, to protect the passenger. So if you followed that through, if that definition remained unchanged, as the car's primary job is to protect the passenger, then from a duty standpoint, it would always choose to protect the passenger. then the ethical question would, I guess, be, is protecting the passenger at all costs actually the primary purpose of a vehicle?
Great, thank you. And you're right. And you know, what we notice here is we're looking at a broader picture, and then we're narrowing that down, right? From a broader perspective, you know, we want to impart safety, right, on the user and everyone around them. Then we narrow that down to what are the limits of that safety, right? Group 7, 8, and 9, the idea of virtue. Let's see, who can anyone volunteering from 7, 8, or 9?
I'll volunteer.
Great, thank you.
So what we discussed was basically the virtue approach would be comparing the decision and the value of what the car should make compared to the ideal human value. And like the ideal human value, we always kind of just view it as being incredibly selfless and self-sacrificing. I mean, it's why in every action movie, the hero always makes the sacrifice to save the baby falling out of the building or whatever. So like in that scenario, the idea would be, well, as the driver of the car or as the, you know, passenger in the car, you'd want to sacrifice yourself in order to save others. But the ethical question that we kind of, or the ethical question that really is need to be answered is, what is the um, value or the, satisfying of the customer on the company side versus, the overall safety of the world surrounding them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So big picture, yeah. I mean, these are the questions that we all have to answer. And as you can see from when we go from one perspective or framework to the next, it shifts. Our attention shifts in terms of what we need to answer and, who do we need to involve, right? So I mentioned that this idea of self-sacrificing is something that we were going to apply in the next activity. And so one of the things I want to share with you is this TED video. And the TED video actually talks about those ethics and how do we manage that, right? And so let's have a listen to or take a look at this short video.
This is a thought experiment. Let's say at some point in the not-so-distant future, you're barreling down the highway in your self-driving car, and you find yourself boxed in on all sides by other cars. Suddenly, a large, heavy object falls off the truck in front of you. Your car can't stop in time to avoid the collision, so it needs to make a decision. Go straight and hit the object, swerve left into an SUV, or swerve right into a motorcycle. Should it prioritize your safety by hitting the motorcycle, minimize danger to others by not swerving, even if it means hitting the large object and sacrificing your life, or take the middle ground by hitting the SUV, which has a high passenger safety rating? So what should the self-driving car do? If we were driving that boxed-in car in manual mode, whichever way we react would be understood as just that, a reaction, not a deliberate decision. It would be an instinctual, panicked move with no forethought or malice. But if a programmer were to instruct the car to make the same move, given conditions it may sense in the future, well, that looks more like premeditated homicide. Now, to be fair, self-driving cars are predicted to dramatically reduce traffic accidents and fatalities by removing human error from the driving equation. Plus, there may be all sorts of other benefits: eased road congestion, decreased harmful emissions, and minimized unproductive and stressful driving time. But accidents can and will still happen, and when they do, their outcomes may be determined months or years in advance by programmers or policymakers. And they'll have some difficult decisions to make. It's tempting to offer up general decision-making principles like minimize harm, But even that quickly leads to morally murky decisions. For example, let's say we have the same initial setup, but now there's a motorcyclist wearing a helmet to your left and another one without a helmet to your right. Which one should your robot car crash into? If you say the biker with the helmet because she's more likely to survive, then aren't you penalizing the responsible motorist? If instead you say the biker without the helmet because he's acting irresponsibly, then you've gone way beyond the initial design principle about minimizing harm, and the robot car is now meting out street justice. The ethical considerations get more complicated here. In both of our scenarios, the underlying design is functioning as a targeting algorithm of sorts. In other words, it's systematically favoring or discriminating against a certain type of object to crash into. And the owners of the target vehicles will suffer the negative consequences of this algorithm through no fault of their own. Our new technologies are opening up many other novel ethical dilemmas. For instance, if you had to choose between a car that would always save as many lives as possible in an accident, or one that would save you at any cost, which would you buy? What happens if the cars start analyzing and factoring in the passengers of the cars and the particulars of their lives? Could it be the case that a random decision is still better than a predetermined one designed to minimize harm? And who should be making all of these decisions anyhow? Programmers? Companies? Governments? Reality may not play out exactly like our thought experiments, but that's not the point. They're designed to isolate and stress test our intuitions on ethics, just like science experiments do for the physical world. Spotting these moral hairpin turns now will help us maneuver the unfamiliar road of technology ethics and allow us to cruise confidently and conscientiously into our brave new future.
So based on this video, we have some questions to answer, and we're going to go through the multiple choice questions real quick. But if you would, when you see the question, if you would respond in the chat, right? So first question in the scenario is, in the first scenario, which option would best protect the autonomous car and its occupants? A, the car does not swerve and stays in its lane. B, the car swerves towards the large SUV. C, none of the above. Or D, car swerves toward the motorcyclist. If you recall from the video, what would you vote for? Okay, D. And that is correct. In the second scenario, which option would follow the design principle to minimize harm? A, the car swerves toward the motorcyclist with the helmet. B, the car does not swerve and stays in its lane. C, the car swerves towards the motorcyclist without the helmet. Or D, none of the above. Okay, I'm going to go with A. Correct. Last question we'll cover for today. If a robot car reacts exactly as a human would in a crash scenario, which would be true? A random number engine is needed since some human actions are random. B, the same actions should result in the same legal consequences. C, none of the above. Or D, impossible because the sensors on a robot car will enable it to avoid crashes altogether. Okay, I'm seeing B. Nope, that wasn't it. We'll go with A. Nope, that wasn't it either. How about D? Nope, that wasn't it. So it is none of the above. So I also want to direct you to a website, and I'll post this in Canvas, okay? And it's called The Moral Machine. The Moral Machine was developed by researchers at MIT. And it actually goes through these scenarios point by point, and would throw in multiple contexts and circumstances that would make you think differently. Okay. And so on your free time, check this out. It's moralmachine.net. Okay. And it really takes into account your perspectives when it comes to making, these types of decisions. In the end, when we think about the idea of using our moral ethics, right, and our moral values and the frameworks that we've outlined here, as engineers, we have to think of some process that allows us to not only make these decisions quickly, but also consistently in everything that we do. Again, we go back to the values and the frameworks that's established for the organizations that you work with. Okay, because one, you're working for them. Two, they're paying your paycheck. And three, you've joined that organization because it does something good within the area or a society. Okay. And so thinking about it from that sense, think about the values of the organization first, then apply your own values as that of an engineer. Okay. And then finally, your personal values. When we think about those three things, the values of the individual, the values of the profession, and the values of the company, right? Where's their alignment? And also, where's their schism or gaps? Okay. Something to keep in mind as we think about how we contribute to an organization, but more importantly, contribute to society. Okay. So next week, we think about these ideas of actions and apply it to that of leadership. And, how are we as leaders working together? And so that will be next week's session. We will go into our Clifton Strengths results again. And so make sure you have that available. Most of you have that in mind already because you've submitted your essay. So thank you very much. And so I will go through that over the weekend, but big picture, we'll pick this up next week, focusing on leadership and leadership development. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.